This is Jay Rogers. I'm the director of the Forerunner, and I haven't done one of these in a while. I think last one I did was at the beginning of the summer, but I wanted to look at an article that I did back a few weeks ago. And this article is entitled "How the Western Media is Framing Zelensky's Offensive into Kursk, Russia." This is from August 16th, and not that long ago, but I'm going to go through it again, and I'm also going to give some updates. So basically what happened about a week before this, I think on August 6th or 7th, Ukrainian forces made an incursion into the Kursk region of Russia, and the probable goal was to capture a nuclear power plant 96 kilometers away as a bargaining chip in coming negotiations. So this is a little thing from Deep State Map. And you see the Ukrainians began here along the border. They took this area and they were hoping to capture this nuclear power plant on this lake here. You can actually see a better map of it here. This is the border down here. This is the Kursk nuclear power plant, and then there's the city of Kursk right there. All right. So this was the purpose of this was to try to get Russia into negotiations. So this was from about a month ago. I say a week ago here. It's almost a month ago. Next week it will be a month. But President Volodymyr Zelenskyy launched an attack above the northern border of Ukraine's territory into the Kursk region of Russia. This is a sparsely populated woodland area with numerous small villages. So it's not a city. There are villages of a few people. I think the largest village is something like 2,000 people or something like that. The objective may have been to reach the Kursk nuclear power plant located almost 100 kilometers to the north from the Ukrainian border. Since Russia took the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in early 2022 and has since absorbed it into the Russian Federation, the gamble toward Kursk may have been planned as an attempt to gain a bargaining chip in future negotiations. So this is how the Western media is framing Kursk. First of all, The Guardian ran a headline saying that the offensive into Kursk, into Russia, is aimed at drawing Moscow into fair talks. So this was a report that featured comments by a Zelenskyy aide, and Moscow claims that Western NATO advisors are embedded in the Ukrainian special forces pushing into the Kursk region. So this is that article here. This is from The Guardian. And then the Western media has been basically in agreement that the Kursk offensive was meant to draw Russia into peace talks. So that's a very big shift. A month ago, or back in June, we were told that NATO was insisting that Ukraine retake all of Russia's gains, including Crimea. And we're actually starting to hear that again now, funnily enough. And then further, Zelenskyy's peace plan required regime change in Moscow, putting Putin and Kremlin officials on trial for war crimes. So that's seriously what they were suggesting that the end of the war would be. But since that time, Western media outlets have now acknowledged that Ukraine has all but lost the battle for Donbass. So this is a little article from the Wall Street Journal, which is very pro-Ukraine, pro-Western. As Ukraine invades Russia, Kyiv's troops are in trouble on the Eastern Front. Okay, so a lot of these are behind paywalls, but you can see the headline of this one. And then even the New York Times ran an opinion piece by a very strident anti-Putin journalist, someone that's, Russian but hates Putin. And they said the Ukraine war is over due to NATO's blunders. Okay, so this is that article right here. Let me get out of this and launch it again. Okay, Putin has victory in his grasp. So that was all an article just kind of ruining. This was a person who basically is very much against Russia. So it's very very anti-Russian person. This is a good synopsis of this by Steve Turley. I have this embedded on the website. You can see that. So then there was another report that circulated claiming that the former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, planned and facilitated the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in 2022, which was the largest act of eco-terrorism in history. All right. I believe that story is concocted. It's nonsense, but that's, this is basically the story here. Ukraine rejects this nonsense, the alleged role in Nord Stream blast. I agree. I think it was, as Seymour Hersh says, it was something that was done by the CIA using the Norwegians or some Scandinavian country for helpers. And Seymour Hersh is a very good journalist and had good sources on that. So, but they're trying to blame it now on Ukraine, especially Zelenskyy. We'll find out why in a minute here. So this is like a part of a pattern. This is, how does Nord Stream 2 actually figure into the incursion of Kursk? Okay, so it's related. This is all part of their pattern of bizarre war propaganda. Back in 2022, they were shelling the nuclear power plant held by the Russians. That's the one that was in the Zaporozhye region. And then they claimed that Russia was bombing its own nuclear power plant. So maybe that's what they were planning to do here, to cause some type of a nuclear threat, surround the nuclear power plant, claim that Russia was retaliating and bombing its plant. And then that would force the Western countries to come in and force negotiations or to invade, who knows. Back in 2022, the Ukrainians killed a dozen or so collaborators in Bucha. And I know a lot of people don't believe that, but there's actually some pretty good evidence of that. There was a French soldier who's actually Ukrainian Nazis were after him, trying to kill him because he had evidence that it was actually Ukrainian forces that killed Russian collaborators in Bucha. And then they lined them up along the street and claimed that the Russians had killed them. And then supposedly they found dozens of more bodies and then hundreds of more bodies. And the story just kind of spread and spread. But most people believe that, yeah, the Russians, they were responsible for this massacre in Bucha. All right, including its own collaborators, which is, there's actually recordings that show that, Ukraine was planning on shooting Russian collaborators in the legs. So. And then they blew up Nord Stream 2 and claimed that Russia blew up its own pipeline, and so on. So a lot of this propaganda, if you really follow it closely, is very clownish, but very few people in the West follow geopolitics, foreign affairs very closely. So much of this is just swallowed whole. And most Americans think Russia is just this Orwellian nightmare. It's a totalitarian state, Putin's a killer, and so on. So any horror story that blames the Russians just fits Western liberal media narrative perfectly. Seymour Hersh, as I said, he has very good evidence that the CIA facilitated the Nord Stream 2 sabotage, and you can look that up. I have the actual articles from Substack, but there's lots of articles on that. And Seymour Hersh is Pulitzer Prize winner. He's considered to be the greatest investigative journalist in history. So believe him or believe that the former commander of the Ukrainian armed force blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. So here's the question: If Zelenskyy is the most popular presidential candidate in Ukraine as of last year, all right. Seymour Hersh said that President Biden knew about the plan at least 6 months before the war. They had bombs that were on the Nord Stream pipeline and they blew them up. So then they turn around, 2 years later and they blame Zelenskyy. Okay, so why? Zelenskyy had a 92% favorability rating with Ukrainians, which was significantly above Zelensky's 77%. And so then Zelenskyy was fired for challenging Zelensky's orders in the field, but then he was promoted to ambassador in Britain. All right, so if Zelenskyy actually blew up a pipeline in the North Atlantic, in the North Sea, why isn't he being arrested? He's an eco-terrorist, so why isn't he being arrested? Well, because everyone knows it's fiction. So why even blame him? Why come up with the story? Well, it's very simple. If peace negotiations begin with Russia, martial law in Ukraine has to be lifted. And then Zelenskyy, whose term expired in May 2024, must stand for re-election or withdraw from the election. And so the problem is that Zelenskyy is an avowed admirer of Stepan Bandera. Stepan Bandera was a World War II Nazi collaborator. He founded a resistance movement that killed tens of thousands of Russians, Jews, Poles, Romanians, Gypsies. Some people say it's over 100,000 people that were killed, including Jews that were just shot, rounded up and shot in the head and so on during World War II. And then the Banderites were active from World War II until 1955, and they were sponsored by the CIA. And the whole point was to create Ukrainian nationalism and to fight against the Soviets underground. So that might be a problem if you have Zelenskyy who supports this group and has said that Stepan Bandera is his hero. And of course, it's also bad PR for US NATO to be supporting a neo-Nazi admirer as the president of Ukraine. Okay, so now the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces is a guy named Alexander Syrsky. Syrsky replaced Zelenskyy in early 2024. Syrsky was a lower-ranking colonel general and not qualified for a job no one else wanted. He's also known as the butcher by his own troops, okay? This is the other article. I forgot to show you that, but this is Zelenskyy. This is a pretty good article. And he's known as the butcher. Okay, what does that mean exactly? Well, Syrsky was criticized for pursuing bloody Soviet-style military tactics, which resulted in significant Ukrainian losses during the Battle of Bakhmut. He was nicknamed General 200, which is a reference to Cargo 200, which is Soviet military code denoting military fatalities. Syrsky was born in Russia during the time of the Soviet Union to an ethnically Russian family, and he's said to have killed more Ukrainians due to incompetence than the entire Russian army. That's an exaggeration, but that's what the Ukrainians think about him. So he's not as popular as Zelenskyy, but he's still taking success. He's taking credit for the marginal success in Kursk, and Kursk is actually going badly right now. So you wonder what's going to happen. I think that it could very easily result in the collapse of the Zelenskyy regime, and that could come as soon as the Russian capture of this city here, which is known as Pokrovsk. And so right now, there are huge areas of the Ukraine military front lines in Donetsk that are collapsing. I'm going to show you a map of that in a few minutes here. So there's a few fortifications west of Pokrovsk, which would be in this direction over here. This is the Russian troops. They're heading towards Pokrovsk. And once they get past Pokrovsk, they could go all the way to the Dnieper River. They can go north. They can go south. They could go all in directions. And then much of the Ukrainian army in this region could be caught in large cauldrons with few or no defense lines to the west. If that happens, it could be a situation like in 2015 when Ukrainian militias were caught in a cauldron in the Battle of Desalby. Okay, this is the Battle of Desalby, a little Wikipedia article, and you can see here that this is what happened. And this led directly to the Minsk II agreements because people in Europe that were supporting Ukraine just panicked when they found out that the pro-Russian forces had trapped almost the entire grouping of the Ukrainian militias, which at that time were these kind of independent militias that were fighting in the battles back in 2015. And they allowed them to withdraw, and they entered into a peace agreement. Okay? So this is the level of collapse that could be happening. But this is a much larger army rather than 10,000, 20,000 troops. We're dealing with 200,000, 300,000 troops. So if that level of collapse happens, there could be chaos in Kyiv surrounding the government. It could also cause panic among the NATO brass. So what's been going on since Ukraine captured the territory? It's not an insignificantly small amount of territory. It's fairly large, but they didn't get anywhere near Kursk. But they had to take troops from this area in order to fortify it. Once their special troops got caught in there, they had to bring in more forces. Once they didn't get all the way to Kursk, they had to reinforce, and they had to pull troops from the front lines, and that caused this big bulge to happen. And Russia is moving so fast that they're even themselves are surprised by it. All right. So what could happen here is that once they reach the city, the defense lines of Ukraine will be cut in half. So I think what could happen is that Zelensky could be out of power by the end of the year. And I think that Sersky could be promoted for the purpose of negotiating with Russia because they don't want Zelensky. Zelensky can't negotiate with Russia. Russia will not negotiate with him. And Zelensky refuses to negotiate with Russia. So if that happens, there's a real possibility of a coming civil war. You have the Kyiv government that is supporting Zelensky, but then you also have these neo-Nazis. It's not like the majority of Ukraine or the Ukrainian government, but there are factions within the battalions that are fighting right now. And I did this article earlier about this, Ukraine's coming neo-Nazi civil war. I linked to that. That's my theory about how it's going to end up. A lot of wars in this area of the world end up in revolutions afterwards, and also in civil wars that happened in the Russian Revolution and several other times in history. So this group, just so you know, I'm not making this up. The Azov battalion was banned from receiving aid from the United States. The U.S. has lifted long-standing ban on weapons and supplies to train Ukraine's Azov brigade, whose origins were mired in controversy over alleged links to far-right groups. Well, by that, they mean the neo-Nazis, the admirers of Stepan Bandera, who hate Russians, hate Jews. They want like a Ukrainian racist state, essentially, where only Ukrainians would, it's a very, you can look into this. It's very scary kind of a thing. They're into all kinds of occult nonsense and all this other stuff too, but Moscow condemned the decision, with Kremlin spokesman Peskov saying the U.S. was prepared to flirt with the neo-Nazis to suppress Russia. And this is kind of funny because this is the BBC. Putin has repeatedly made false claims about a neo-Nazi regime, which is, only the head of the military. That's it. And a few other people in Zelensky's cabinet. But that's all. So the coup and civil war scenario could take place by the end of October. And, I have friends in Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine 10 times in my lifetime, went all over the country, or else the western part of the country in Kiev, and, don't want to see anyone in that situation. It'd be very dangerous for everyone involved. It'd be dangerous for Russians. It'd be dangerous for Ukrainians. It'd be dangerous for the West as well, because it could escalate. And, but we need to remember it's a possibility. All right. So what I want to do from here is I just want to show you real quick. This is, deep state map, and I'm going to go to full screen here. It doesn't really matter, I guess. So this is, I can make this bigger, I guess. There we go. All right, so this is Kursk, as they say. And this is Sumy region. And what happened was the Ukrainians did this very sudden attack and took a lot of land in a short period of time. So I'm going to just kind of zoom in on this and show you since, if we go back a month ago, we're back to the 7th. All right. This is what happened in that time period. You see very sudden advance around this village called Sudza. And they made their first incursion, kept expanding, and that lasted for about a week. And then a little bit more expansion in week 2, but then in the last 2 weeks, there's been nothing. Okay, getting all the way to the month of September, and that's where we are right now. Okay. Now, in the meantime, when they did that first little advance, they lost a lot of men, a lot of equipment, and they had to bring in reinforcements. Where did they get the reinforcements from? Well, they had to pull them from these lines right here, and that's caused a collapse along these lines. Now, there's another force, which are the reserves, and all of the reserves are around Sumy. If Kursk fails, they're either going to have to send reinforcements in, or they could invade in another direction called toward Belgorod, which is this area here where the Russians are trying to push into Ukraine, or they could send them back to the south and the east. But the point is that Ukraine has very few reserves left to be able to move around. All the other reserves are stretched out along this long line. And the Russians, we don't really know what the troop numbers are, but just to give you an idea, I'm going to try to show you the whole front line. And I want to move back. There we go. That's a good. I'm going to go back to the same time period, which is a month ago. That's a pretty good. All right, so let's go back to beginning of August. And that's where the Russians were at. And I want you to look at down south along Vuhledar, toward Pokrovsk. There's another city up here called Seversk you can't see on the map. And then there's two other cities called Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. And in this area of Donetsk, that would be basically it. They take Seversk first, get Seversk in a cauldron, cut these lines off here, surround Vuhledar, then they would very easily be able to take the rest of this line right here, which is the Donetsk line. And that might be it for the war. I mean, I know that sounds kind of outrageous that the war could be over that fast, but it literally could end in October because the Ukrainians would not be able to defend anything. And they would have to negotiate. Otherwise, the Russians would just be able to start taking more territories and other oblasts and things like that. So that's when I think negotiations are going to start. Okay, so let's play this from August and see how fast the Russians have advanced while the Ukrainians were on this very foolish mission to the north. So right around here, the Russians are starting to move a little bit. And then right here, the Ukrainians have left the territory. They've left it undefended. And you can just see what the Russians have done in the meantime. And it's day by day, hour by hour. Okay, and that brings us up to today. So, and there's actually more territory that's been taken since this right here. Like if you look at, this is a Ukrainian map, a pro-Ukrainian map. What's really interesting is this. Vuhledar is one of the most strongly fortified areas, and for a long time the Russians were trying to assault it directly, and they were getting slaughtered. You know, like Ukraine took this area back. They were almost all the way up into the city. Ukraine took it back, and the Russians since July, though, have been trying to. Well, just go back 2 weeks ago. I mean, this is August. Let's go back to the 22nd. There's the 8th. There's the 1st. Watch what happens. So you can't assault Vuhledar directly because it's too fortified. It's just they've had 10 years to build this fortifications up. There's underground bunkers. There's fallout shelters. There's buildings. It's just like it's an insane amount of fortification. So if they get them in a cauldron, then basically they've captured them and they would have to withdraw. So that's kind of like the Russian plan at this point. So watch what's happened in the last month here. So they go very slowly. And then what happens is once we get into the last 2 weeks, which is right here, there's a little explosion. And so you can see what the Russians are trying to do. They're going to try to take this village, this little city here, and then this here, and then just get them caught. Same thing is happening right there. This is this whole region will be gone in another week or two because they have it in a cauldron. And the other one is Seversk, or Konstantinivka, if I'm not saying that correctly. This is another one that's fortified. Didn't mention that earlier. And then the other one would be Seversk. Now, the Seversk area already, Russians are moving very close to. Let's kind of zoom out here so you can see what's happened. This would be the last two where there'll be a big, and the Ukrainians may have to surrender before the Russians get there. But if we go into 2025, then that will be the big tank battle that will, the big tank and aerial battle. I don't know what kind of weapons they're going to use, but that's going to be the big battle that's going to be the end of the war, Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. Russia is not going to take all of Ukraine. They're going to take the oblast that they've annexed into Russia, and then they're going to negotiate with Ukraine. And if Ukraine doesn't negotiate, then they'll continue. But that's basically how things look. So there really hasn't been really that much movement here, but you can see what's happening. Little fingers, little salients starting to develop. And when they get into the supply roads and they cut off their supplies and they're able to get the city in a cauldron, then all the forces in this area are going to have to withdraw to Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, and that will be the next battle. To the north of this is another region called Krasny Liman and Kupiansk. And you can also see what's been happening here if we go back a month as well. Not as dramatic as what's happening in Pokrovsk, but they're trying to get to this river because there's a supply road that runs on one side of this where the Ukrainians are able to defend these territories in here. And as you can see, what's happening, they're taking over little villages and getting closer and closer to these supply roads. So this is the Oskol River, and that's another key. That's kind of like a boundary. It's very easily, these are very easily defendable from this side. And what the Russians have to do is get to any place along these supply roads, and then the Ukrainians are in trouble. So that's that. That's the video. There is one commentator who always says that he condemns all war anywhere in the world. I'm not a pacifist, and I think that this is tragic. It's something that Americans have been planning. Not all the presidents, but people in the administrations, they've been planning for a war with Russia really since the 90s. And always the idea was get more countries into NATO and then use a country like Ukraine or like Belarus to fortify them and then fight a proxy war with Russia. And the idea is get another liberal president in there, like a puppet president. And now the Russians do the same thing. They have this guy in Belarus, his name is Lukashenko. And he's basically a Russian puppet. I mean, he's very loyal to the Kremlin. Russia supports Belarus. And for a while, they had pro-Russian presidents in Ukraine, too. So, but this is, the way I look at it, like this is their territory. This is their area. And our country cannot afford to be like playing with this. We can't afford to be like in every country in the world trying to make sure that American hegemony still exists. That's all coming to an end very fast. And the end of the Ukraine war will also be the end of the unipolar Western hegemony, like the dominance of the West in the whole world, and then the emergence of the multipolar world. So the next couple of months to October are going to be very interesting. What happens in our elections, what happens geopolitically, it's going to get crazier and crazier. So I'll talk to you and hopefully before another month. So